Excuse me. Thanks, Gordy, and good morning. So I guess it's time for some numbers. This year, our underlying profit of $203.5 million is an increase of 14.2% on last year. This means we have quadrupled our underlying profit in the past 10 years. Earnings from our existing villages were the main driver of the result, with resale gains being the biggest contributor. Development margin declined slightly because our build was lower. Our reported profit was up 8.8% to $388.2 million on the back of good trading and valuation gains of $185 million. The valuation rose because, one, we added 458 new units to the valuation. Two, prices lifted over the year, reflecting strong demand in the housing market. And three, our valuer lifted our 5-year plus long-term growth rates from 2.8 to 3.4% in the first half. During the year, we invested $479 million. This was spent on the following: $111 million on land, with the land bank lifting 7%, $296 million building new villages where we will recycle capital, $27 million on a range of projects, including Ryman and completing the last of our emergency generator program, and $45 million was invested in upgrading our existing villages. With such a major investment during the year, our working capital debt has increased to $1.06 billion. We're in a very strong financial position with total assets of $5.8 billion, and shareholder equity has lifted by 17% to $1.9 billion. This means both our total assets and our net assets have more than doubled over the past 5 years. We've seen a $100 million increase in our debtors to $357 million at year end, which is similar to an increase we experienced back in 2015. This is a function of a really strong last quarter and an increase in the average sale price of our new units of $300,000. Our average sale price for new units lifted from $440,000 last year to $740,000 this year. This shows the impact of building in higher value locations. Our average resale pricing has also increased from $447,000 to $516,000. Our debt to debt plus equity ratio is 35% and consistent with last year. Our debt is productive debt. It's investing the bulk of it in new villages where we recycle capital, which establishes a tail of recurring cash flows. We continue to have very supportive banking partners. They understand our growth plans and they back us. I have increased our facility to $1.3 billion and extended our tenure with 75% of our facility now either 4 or 5 years. Previously, all of our bank facility had a maturity of 3 years or less. Development margin was 19.2%, which is just outside the range we normally target of 20 to 25%. We have previously advised you that Bob Scott and Petone has been a very low margin site due to its seismic requirements. Without Bob Scott, our margin would have been 22%. Our dollar margin per unit has increased by $35,000 to $138,000, which shows again the benefit of building in higher value locations. Resales have been the big driver of our earnings this year, and the resales bank of gains still to come has increased by $56 million to $815 million. The $815 million of pent-up gains means we can expect our resale earnings to keep on growing even if the housing market was flat for several years, because volumes increase as villages mature. Deferred management fees also reset to new price levels with each resale, creating a compound effect. We continue to monitor affordability. Our residents in Auckland and Melbourne free up significant amounts of cash when they move into a Ryman village. Residents moving into an independent unit in a village in Auckland typically free up $200,000 when they sell their house. And service departments are freeing up nearly $600,000. In Melbourne, this is even greater. And I just want to add to what David and Gordy have mentioned earlier. Kev has left us with a great business model that has stood the test of time. It is a model which is able to recycle capital. It creates a growing tail of earnings and doubles profits every 5 years, and continues to reward shareholders with a growing dividend stream from those profits. This year is another example of the model in action. We have invested $479 million without needing to raise extra capital. Our profits increased this year thanks to a growing tail of earnings at existing villages where we've already recycled capital. Our underlying profit was over $200 million, double the $100 million we reported in 2013, and our dividend has also doubled in line with our growth in profits, going from $50 million to $100 million over the past 5 years. The model has worked since listing in 1999 when we raised $25 million. We have now invested $3.1 billion in our portfolio, paid out growing dividend stream to shareholders of $690 million, and we've never had to raise new capital. Thank you, and over to David.
Look, thank you, Gordy and Dave. Those were great presentations, really marvellous. And look at the opportunity now for some questions from the floor in the first instance. And if you just would wait for the microphone, that's great.
Thank you, and congratulations on the result, guys. Just a quick question about bank debt. You would have just given the growth plans that you took us through during the presentation, and there's a number of new villages coming through. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of where you see that going in the next 12 months?
Yeah. Dave, would you like to answer that?
So the big thing, I guess, we've got a significant amount of debtors which we will realise over the first half of this year. Our debt will sort of continue to lift as we invest in the new sites, but we don't expect it to lift significantly, and the facility we have in place is more than adequate to meet those growth demands.
I guess the comment I'd make is that the debt we have predominantly is basically construction debt. It's what enables our development. If we stop developing, and we are not going to, our debt would be, our core debt would be very low.
Yeah, and Stephen, we're going to see some really good cashing up at Campbell Road, at Brandon Park. We're going to see cash starting to come in at Linfield and Tropicana. Obviously, the year-end debt is coming through, resales are lifting, so generally earnings are lifting. And of course, you get the kicker of the bonds coming through at Brandon Park as well, which we wouldn't normally see at a New Zealand site. So the model in action of sites in progress starting to deliver cash in, while new ones like, say getting going at Burwood East and Geelong and Coburg and so on, that sort of recycling and capital model is very much what we have in mind.
Great.
Yeah.
And just in terms of where the land bank sits at the moment, 4,200 units, do you see that increasing in the next 12 months at perhaps a slightly faster pace than it has in the last year?
That's just a New Zealand one, isn't it?
That'll just be the units without the care, I assume.
Yeah, the retirement village.
Just the retirement village units.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't really sort of think about it like that, I suppose. It's about 6,000, isn't it? The land. Yes, the land bank's about 6,000 units and beds. If in New Zealand it's adequate for the sort of rollout that we're doing, around about 800 beds and units per annum, a couple of villages opening a year, we'll just continue to add to that. The Melbourne one, Stephen, is that we will want to lift that over time. So really the Melbourne land bank numbers should fairly be similar-ish to New Zealand in the next couple of years. Yeah.
And Gordy, you talked a little bit about some learnings you've had in Australia and some slight tweaks to strategy. Are there any other learnings you've had during the Brandon Park development process and your other site development processes where you've made a few tweaks to the go-forward plan?
Yeah, look, probably something we would have started much earlier at Brandon Park had we known more, is that the construction team would have been more engaged with the local council about how to get the building drawings endorsed so that we could start work faster on the site. So we were ready to go, but they have to basically stamp the whole plan, and obviously it's a large-scale development. And some of the, it's not a criticism of the councils at all, but just some of the councils what we do can be quite a large-scale development in this, if we're doing stuff in a suburban area. So it's good to start an earlier dialogue about how that's going to be handled, and we've certainly started doing that at other sites now.
The other thing is, of course, that we're quite active in community consultation, which we didn't used to pay as much attention to in earlier years, whereas we see that as being really important to get the community on side with us so that the opposition to the village doesn't rise and so that people understand that we want to be good citizens in their community. So that takes time.
Yeah. So, the Coburg consent process was a great example, actually. I sort of hopped in on that, on the promise that I wouldn't say anything. To that meeting, and it was really interesting, actually. All of the key people there, all of the councillors, the neighbours, even some of the neighbours who perhaps maybe weren't that enamoured with us, were very civil to Andrew and the team. It was clear they'd been having good discussions, and we'd heard people's concerns, and we'd actually made a number of changes to the scheme to take into account community feedback. And so that sort of pre-consultation before we finalise plans is really, really important. And so we've got 2 lots of consultation teams ready. One with Debbie, she's got community relations teams where they're looking to build on the ground, build people's awareness of what Ryman is bringing to the community. And longer term, some of those people will become sales advisors. And then in Andrew's area, they're obviously consulting earlier with councillors and neighbours and that sort of thing, and having more drop-in days and so on. Yeah.
And just maybe one last one from me before I give someone else a turn. The new government in New Zealand's got a lot of reviews going on, some of which affect your sector. So just wondering if you had any comments that you can share with us in terms of your expectations of any potential changes in the regulatory framework for the aged care side of the business in particular, or the funding side, and any comments you could make on the net impact from the wage equality settlement that's already come through, where there was an impact in the second half and going into next year.
Yeah. Look, the reality is, I think it's understood by all sides, government and operators, that the equal pay settlement, which has a schedule of pay going out 5 years, agreed between the Crown and the unions, is one which will be fully funded by the government, and that the sector will contribute research and statistical data to show what the appropriate amount is, so that the sector is no worse off for a settlement which was reached between the Crown and the workforce. So there is a clear expectation that is fully funded. The extent of any relativity adjustments, will be something that the sector will discuss with the government, I'm sure. And I believe that yesterday there wasn't clarity in the detail of the budget around what the funding envelope is for aged care in New Zealand from 1 July, but that will be worked through over the next 2 or 3 weeks. It'll be a negotiation of some sort. I suspect, though, that when you read articles like what's happening at Middlemore Hospital, that really people in government understand that the sector provides an incredibly important resource for the health infrastructure of New Zealand. The recent data from Interai, which is the international assessment tool used throughout New Zealand, shows that the health outcomes achieved in aged care for social isolation, loneliness and also pain medication substantially improve when people enter into an aged care facility. So from a government point of view, they're getting actually a very, very good price, great health outcomes from what the sector does, and with no capital expenditure exposure like exists in a public hospital, and most public hospitals are at capacity, as you know. So I think that the way that the government or any government looks at the aged care sector is generally one. Of course, there's a wee bit of natural tension around standards and funding and stuff, but overall I would say that the government would see aged care as being a very positive part of the mainstream health outcomes for people, for older people.
Thank you.
Hi, Gordy, just following on from that, do you think you and the industry at large makes enough of the fact that every new unit you bring on board in the retirement village sector is equivalent to building a house just for the general housing market. I don't hear that publicity from industry players, and it seems like a very popular, or it seems like in addition to the health benefits you bring, it seems like there's an additional benefit.
Yeah, well, that's certainly very right, Ross. And we do talk with ministers about that. We've met with the Minister of Housing, Phil Twyford, and discussed those very points, because obviously they've got challenging build targets in relation to Kiwi build, particularly in Auckland. And it's important that people understand that when we build a village like in Devonport, that's going to free up 500 homes in the Devonport area where younger people can come in and use pre-existing infrastructure in the form of schools and stormwater and roading and libraries, and we create the perfect tailor-made environment for older people to really enjoy and get the health and care and companionship that they need. So it's a win-win. You're almost building 2 units for the price of 1 when we do it. And so we are actually explaining that sort of stuff quite carefully to regulators and officials.
Quite typically, these homes will be 3-bedroom homes, of which 1 bedroom is being used, and the bus stop will be outside. So it's set to actually address some significant housing shortage that exists in Auckland. Makes a big difference.
Yeah, we're part of the housing solution.
Yeah, that's what we say. Ari.
Morning. First question just on the project capex over the last couple of years. I think it's just over 60 million, and I notice you've got about $20 million of intangibles, so Ryman's clearly been a significant amount. Can you just talk about the other key components of that 60 million of project capex over the last couple of years? And with Ryman sort of coming to an end, the generator project I think is in there as well, what your guidance would be for sort of the project capex level of investment over the next couple of years?
Yeah, and the other part, you're right, Ari, it's Ryman has been a big part of that over the last 2 or 3 years. It's been a really significant investment for the company. Obviously, generators have been a big investment for the company too. Did you know? Did you know that since we've put them in, I'm sure you haven't set me up for a live question to link into this, but I can't help it. That since we've put them in, our generators have fired up 150 times due to power grid failures. Isn't that amazing? Up and down the country. And in Auckland, do you know when you had that night with Category 2 hurricanes? 5 of our Auckland villages all went onto generator that evening. I was getting text messages through on my emergency app going ping, Bruce McLaren's on, ping, Evan Hillary's on, ping, Hilda Ross is on, and we even went on in Christchurch. So it was certainly money well spent. We've also had some one-off capex in many ways at Malvina Major, where we've had to do a pretty significant refurbishment and redo there, obviously post-earthquake. And with some of the sort of water tightness issues at that village, and also we've had some work that's still ongoing down in Francis Hodgkins regarding stability of the just doing things like soil nailing into the cliff there just to keep it nice and tidy. Dave, what would you add to that?
Well, there's also further sort of IT spend as well. Like the Ryman is the software aspect of that, but we're also rolling out a significant amount of tablets and IT infrastructure across our villages to support that. So that's been a big investment as well. Like we have to have Wi-Fi networks reliable right throughout. So we've invested very heavily in the IT infrastructure.
In terms of guidance, probably the best answer for you, Ari, is it should be less actually. It should be less because we have broken the back of the Ryman spend. Going into the end of December last year, we were doing $500,000 a month for some of our external consultants, and that's dropped to 0 because they're gone. So, and we've insourced the team to a team of 16 developers, so that's changed it a lot. So we're working hard on actually reducing that sort of ongoing nature of that.
Just going back to the debt question, and I think you mentioned the receivables, which should be coming in the next 6 months or so as Green Lane obviously settles and that. You mentioned the uptick in debtors in 15, which is about 100 million, and it continued to increase from there and increased about 100 this year. So are you suggesting then that what we're going to see from this point is a release of those debtors, and that you'd actually expect them to be less this time next year?
That could be the case, but I mean, again, if we had an absolute cracker in the last quarter of next year, which we actually don't know with things like resales what that could be, but given the way that just the new build landed at the end and that sort of thing, it could be less.
It's been over 4 years. It's been accumulating up and up and up. Do you think there'll be a release from debtors, or do you think it will keep accumulating?
It's a function of the build in that final quarter as well. So obviously all the residents don't move in on one day. So it just depends on our build program. If we can bring that forward, so we're not doing as much in the second half and last quarter, and spread it more evenly over the year, then yes.
It's probably very hard to say just because of the timing of the build program, Ari, but it could be less.
Yeah, I understand. No, that's cool. Look, I think that's for me. That's just on Brandon Park. Did you recognise 42 units?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, we did.
Cool.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Ari.
Morning, guys. Just a quick question around Brandon Park. What are you expecting for the price of the bed bonds or accommodation bonds, and also what kind of percentage of the stock do you think would be on bonds? And then just lastly, how do you think around the risk around getting licences for the beds in Melbourne and for the new development? How do you kind of manage that and think about that outcome?
Yeah. Shall I do the licences and you do the pricing? Okay. So in relation, hello Jeremy. In relation to the licensing, so there's an active market for bond licensing. We allow for that in the feasibilities when we do all of our sites. In the event that we don't get free licences during a thing called an ACAR round, which is the aged care allocation round, which happens once a year. The next one's coming up fairly soon, isn't it? Yep. So with Brandon Park, we've already got roughly about 120, isn't it? 118 to be precise, beds for that, so that's plenty of beds there for the next 18 months. We will apply in the next ACAR round because ideally we would like to get obviously free additional beds there, and I suspect that one of the things that's been a bit of a hold up for us is once we got that initial allocation, the reality is we hadn't actually started work there for quite some time over the last 2 or 3 years when we were applying. Now that we are well underway, I suspect our application will be seen in a different light, and we've also been having better engagement with the Department of Health and Ageing, or DOHA as it's called there, who've actually visited our Weary Dunlop facility and can see the kind of health and clinical outcomes that we're getting. So, however, if that did not work for some reason, then there is a market for licences, and we would just simply acquire on market.
And in regards to the pricing, it'll be similar levels to Weary Dunlop initially. Obviously, there is a restriction you can apply to the pricing commissioner to go above the 550,000. Initially, we won't do that because for us, getting the residents in and filling what is a large-scale care centre is probably the most important thing. But then we can look to lift the prices in the future years. In terms of uptake, we'd expect similar levels again to Weary Dunlop. So,
what's the mix there?
It's about 75-80% of them pay a bond of some combination. So obviously some are full bond and some are a combination. So I think we've got about 25 mil aged care bonds there. You divide that over the 82 rooms, it gives you an average per room, and we'd expect a similar level.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeremy. Shall we move to any questions from people on the telephone conference call line?
Thank you. If you wish to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. If you wish to cancel your request, please press star 2. If you are on a speakerphone, please pick up the handset to ask your question. Your first question comes from Tony Sherlock from Morningstar. Please go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. Just got a quick question on the resident average age and tenure in Australia or in the Melbourne area is distinct from New Zealand. So on slide 50 of the presentation, Appendix 13, you've outlined the different ages of your portfolio, which is obviously heavily skewed to New Zealand. Can you describe the difference in Melbourne as distinct from what you're seeing in New Zealand?
Yeah. The resident age on each end is very, very similar.
Yeah.
Obviously, the village is still relatively new, so we don't know the sort of long-term tenure, but everything is pointing to it being a very similar mix.
Yeah. I've been to Bury Dunlop probably 2 or 3 times this year, Tony, and spent quite a bit of time with residents, and it is actually extraordinary how similar just the general feel of people and the mix is to New Zealand. I'd possibly even maybe even guess in some ways just slightly older. The care centre, some of the residents probably have slightly lower acuity than what we might see in New Zealand, would be one other observation. Not, obviously not all, but some.
I think it was just more the average tenure of 4.8 years of vacated residence for the independent, which is obviously considerably lower than what some of the ILUs in Australia would be at. So I'm just wondering, so your villages are attracting residents that are nearly 5 years older than many of the established Australian players. Is that right?
Could well be, because some of the established Australian players talk about attracting people in their early 70s, and we tend to be more late 70s and beyond at independent living, and then up from there. Of course, because of the age of Bury Dunlop, any independent living residents who do leave will, by default, be shorter tenure. So I guess we'll just have to see the maturity of the village as it just changes over time.
Okay, that's fine. Just on the care fees per bed, they were up quite considerably. Is that just purely a pass-through of costs? I think it went from nearly 70,000 to circa 80,000 per bed.
Yes, so that's a function of the villages we opened at the back end of last year, been open for the full year this year, but also the government funding increase as a result of the equal pay has also lifted the care fees that we collect per bed.
Yeah, that would be the biggest driver, Dave.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
But all of that got spent.
That's fine. I saw your margin in that area pretty much flat, so that would explain it. Just on and this is last question, slide 45, Appendix 8. I notice you use a higher discount rate in Melbourne, but you've also got a higher dwelling price or appreciation rate going forward. I'm just wondering why that is the case.
First of all, we don't do that. Our external valuer does that. And one of the reasons is, I would imagine, is that we have one village only in Melbourne at the moment, and so perhaps I think they're just being a wee bit sensitive, a wee bit more conservative on the discount rate for now. Initially in New Zealand, villages like Edmund Hillary had a discount rate of 14% applied, so it's consistent in that way, and then it reduced once it became more mature. And then the house price assumptions going forward are really their macroeconomic view for the state of Victoria, which is their in-house view. So we don't really have a comment on that, actually.
Okay. And just on the actual price that you're selling the Brandon Park units at, how much have they differed from your feasibility going in?
Oh, they're up massively. The feasibility feels so long ago, Tony. I actually can't remember. Oh, we're talking quite a few years ago now, but they'd be up. They'd be up a couple hundred, 200 or 300k, yeah.
Okay.
That's a lot.
So your sales rate of those units, can you just refresh me as to the number that you've actually sold and the number that are coming through maybe next year?
We have pre-sold $65 million worth.
Okay.
And hopefully by this time next year we would have sold a lot more. That's the goal.
What have you... So pre-sold, have you taken that through the accounts yet, or you take it on settlement?
Some of it is in the accounts in the form of near completion, but not all of it. There's still, most of it actually not. Yeah.
And then the amount, just the order of magnitude to come through next year?
I'd be giving a forecast. We'd be giving a forecast for an individual village, Tony, which we just don't do.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. There are no further questions at this time. I'll now hand back to Dr. Kerr for closing remarks.
Look, thank you for joining us. Why don't we have a cup of tea and a chat and have some informal discussion? But thank you again for coming, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you.